Kate Falcha, welcome back to Irish Granny Helen. We're doing our Saturday book. This is video number 2, Yes to Life in Spite of Everything by Viktor Frankl. The handbook coping with our current times, written in 1946. If you haven't seen video 1, it sets up the rest of the book. It's a short book. This may be a bit longer video. I didn't make a good decision about ending the other video. I should have gone on for another 10 minutes or so. So this will be longer. Let's get right to it. I don't have enough for a third video, a little too much for a second, and math. Okay. We just got done talking about the fact that what everything boils down to when you become forced to be part of a nameless, faceless mob, you're reduced to an anonymous number. He says the individual becomes the essential self. Then you have to stop looking without. You have to look within. He says existence is a decision. In the past, when things are better, he said decisions are helped by role models, and the critical factor, the existence of other people, the fact of being, is more pivotal even than the written word. Actions speak louder than words, is what he's saying. Words alone are not enough. It's what you do. Do what I do, not what I say. Those sorts of platitudes. He says it's the tremendous responsibility of the few that can be effective to provide a model for other people who may not be capable of being effective in their lives, but they can see modeled how it is that the individual can be essential. There's an ancient myth that the existence of the world depends on 36 truly just people to be alive at all times, and that this will guarantee the continuing moral existence of the whole world. But as soon as one is recognized as one of those 36, unmasked, he disappears, is withdrawn. And the question is why? Frankl guesses that as soon as we are lectured to, we become resentful like children. And I had a little aside. I was doing, I know this is going to come as a shock, but I was doing a little thinking while I was reading this. And I just added in my own thoughts that I think that they're a mirror that we see ourselves and are guilty. So when we see a truly honest, ethical person, if we're not so ethical, they mirror to us what we are. We see reflected what we aren't. We're not them. We see ourselves mirrored, and the guilt comes in. Everything depends on the actions of each individual making the meaning of their moment in time, their reality, true, real. So we must conquer propaganda with our own propaganda. And how do we do that? Individual action. Then we can be an advocate for meaning and value in life. But to ask about the meaning of life, just the mere act of asking casts doubt on it. And doubt's bad. Doubt can lead to despair. So he discusses self-harm. And he talks about it as from a medical point of view. He says, that there are reasons that this happens. Sometimes it's for revenge to punish the people around you. It can be from weariness in the world. But he says that, he's not criticizing this choice, and he's not advocating for this choice. He's saying this is a personal choice. He's laying out the reasons. He's laying out arguments pro and con. And I'm real reluctant to talk too much about it because this is the kind of topic that is not appreciated on YouTube. So I'm going to be tiptoeing here. He said, exhaustion, the feelings of despair can be very transitory. unless they're biochemical. And he mentioned it could be medical. He says exhaustion can be treated if one has meaning in one's life, gives you a touchstone. So how to continue to live despite persistent world weariness, he says we have to have knowledge in our heart. We have to know life's unconditional meanings. Once again, this is individual. Those who can't believe in the meaning of life on the balance sheet of pros and cons, he says, he describes the balance sheet. There's the credit side, which is all the pain and suffering. And then there's the debit side, which is all the happiness and good fortune. And, you can weigh those to make decisions about moving forward. He says, but this is fundamentally incorrect, this balance sheet. He says, we're not in this world for happiness and good fortune. We're not here for fun and games. Life has an essential purpose. And as he said at the beginning, it's not the pursuit of happiness. If you go back to the Declaration, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, what comes first? Life, the meaningfulness of life. And then liberty, the freedom, free will. Then, thirdly, happiness. But first, you address the true meaning. He said a Russian study was done that calculated the incidence of dissatisfaction compared to the feelings of pleasure that people got. I thought this was so interesting. And it was determined that we can't live only for the state of pleasure. The odds are not in our favor. So on the balance sheet of a daily life, you're going to have far more moments usually of difficulty, dissatisfaction, negative challenge, large and small, as compared to really true moments of pleasure. And if this is what you're seeking, you're going to be kind of disappointed. And he asked the question, is this what life stands for? Is it necessary to seek out pleasure? And he reminds us, okay, let's put it in a larger perspective. Let's look at this, let's be real with ourselves. Death is inevitable. We will all die. That's a truth that cannot be argued. And the whole of life, including all pleasure, exists, it stands in the face of this truth. Pleasure cannot give meaning, but the lack of pleasure also cannot take meaning away. And I thought that was very interesting observation. So let's look at this poem that he put. This is from, I'm assuming that this poet is Indian. I could be wrong. Rabindranath Tagore is the poet. I slept and dreamt that life was joy. I awoke and saw that life was duty. I worked and behold, duty was joy. So life is duty. Frankl agrees with that. Joy cannot be pursued as an end in and of itself. It must arise spontaneously from the living of life, the meeting of your duties. Happiness is not a goal. And we're Americans and we're so spoiled and we just think, oh, come on, that's the whole point, right? No, he says, happiness is not a goal. And I know I would like to argue, as well. And then I remind myself this guy was a great thinker. The rest, me, I don't know. But he was a great thinker. He gave a lot of thought to this. He says, happiness is an outcome of the fulfillment of your duty. And luck can only fall in your lap. It can't be hunted down. You cannot seek happiness. I guess you kind of earn happiness. Don't ask, what can I expect from life? Ask, what does life expect of me? What task awaits me? And we should not ask for the meaning of life. Life directs the question. We must be the answer. We must live the answer. Living is constantly responding to the questions put to us. Each moment presents a new momentary challenge to each individual, unique to each of us. And how we respond, how we answer that. And I wrote in the margin here that I'm getting a distinct reminder of Buddhist philosophy, Hermetic principles, Stoic belief. There's a common thread through all of this. He doesn't mention any of that. He's a philosopher, but he's a doctor, a neurologist, a psychologist. He says we have to respond to life with this notion in mind, that the present is everything. Nothing can scare us because this moment, right now, right here, is all that we have. And the trick is to respond with love and ethics and to rest in peace in the moment about where we are in the moment. And our little monkey brains they're just dragging us forward. It's hard. Everything depends on what is expected of us. None of us knows what opportunity, and none of us knows what is expected of us. The opportunity to act in an exceptional way awaits in every moment. And the question is entirely different in each moment for each individual. There is no one meaning of life, is what he's getting at. So it's naive to ask, what's the meaning of life? So that's kind of an immature question. Each challenge demands a different answer in the moment. And for each person, it's different, and it can be answered with a deed. Now, we're not talking situational ethics. People might interpret that way, because there's a foundation to this, to the way in which you should respond with consideration and love for other people, from the desire to contribute to the better good of all. Situational ethics tend to be selfish. He says, we ask ourselves, how can I give my life meaning? I am so inconsequential. What do I matter? He says, it's not about who you are in society as far as status and power, etc. go. It's about not how wide your circle is, but how you fill out the circle you have. I really like that metaphor. I think it's great. He says, in each individual circle, we are irreplaceable. That children's thing, there's nobody quite like you. Your challenges and tasks are only yours. A person is in a large circle that's uncompleted is less fulfilled than someone in a small circle who truly meets his tasks. You can lead a more meaningful life than anyone you envy if that bigger person is unaware of his greater responsibility and doesn't do justice. So he says the unemployed for the unemployed, we're going to take them into consideration. I can't read my handwriting. Work, he says, is not the only way to actively give meaning in life. It can be, but it isn't necessarily. Does work alone make life meaningful? How about people who are doing a drudge job and who are bored at work, who have no agency in their job? They have to find meaning outside of work and in their spare time. You're not going to find it playing video games. I just thought I'd throw that out there. Unemployed with lots of free time, you will have ample time to give your life meaning. He says he has no illusions about how stressful that is. You need to buy groceries, right? He says there's a saying where he comes from, first the grub, then the morals. But he says it's catastrophically meaningless to be fixated only on consumption. This applies to the book we will do next time. People are prepared to starve if starvation has a meaning. Depends on the context. He says it's hard to starve without a sense of morality. Actions give life meaning. So does love. Love for others, love of beauty, love for the greater good. This is love of food. Yeah. He imagines that listening to some favorite sublime music can give you meaning. And you might say to yourself, oh, like listening to, let me think. Trying to think of something, well, Mozart's Requiem or the Queen of the Night aria from the Magic Flute. You listen to that and you might think in that moment, life has been worth it for this moment alone. So to reiterate what we talked about earlier, what's important are actions and appreciation of your own creativity or the art of others. Nature does this for some people. People do this for some people. And finally, suffering can give life meaning. So how do we deal with the limitations to our actions and the limitations to our ability to love? How do we accept unavoidable suffering that makes one capable of fulfilling human values? How do we go? We're going to talk about that. How do we deal with difficulties? It shows who we are, how we deal with difficulties. He says athletes, think about them. They create difficulties for themselves to create growth by overcoming the difficulties. They grow strong muscles by doing horrible exercise. But he says, in general, it's not advisable to create difficulties for oneself. In general, suffering as a result of misfortune is only meaningful if this misfortune has come about through fate and is thus unavoidable and inescapable. Fate, in other words, what happens to us, can certainly be shaped in one way or another. Quote, there is no predicament which cannot be ennobled, either by an achievement or an endurance. Goethe? Never quite sure how to pronounce that. And I wanted to thank the person I just momentarily earlier was looking at my comments, and somebody was helping me with my my German pronunciation, and I'm just gonna come right out right now and say I'm never gonna remember all of it. I will try, but Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell are like the match made in heaven of pronunciation. It's such a challenge. Last night I actually heard somebody famous, I can't remember who, but some well-known TV person was commenting like, oh, I was happy to hear her brother pronounce her name because he says, I've been terrified to say her name out loud for years. It's so difficult. Anyway, let's get back to the serious business at hand here. Either we change our fate if possible, or we willingly accept it if necessary. In either case, we can experience nothing but inner growth through such misfortune. And now we also understand that Holderlin means when he writes, I don't know who Holderlin is, if I step onto my misfortune, I stand higher. So misguided, he says, is misguided to do nothing but complain about your misfortunes or to rail against your fate. That's misguided because you're missing the point. You're ignoring the opportunity. Fate is integral to life. Rebel against fate, circumstances you can't change, and you're not grasping the true meaning of fate. Fate is a part of life. Suffering is a part of life. Life has meaning, therefore suffering has meaning. I guess this is a mathematical formula if you wanted to sit down and do it. Fate equals life, suffering equals life, life equals meaning, fate equals meaning, suffering equals meaning. There's some kind of mathematical equation there. And the suffering has meaning if it is necessary or unavoidable. If you can change your negative fate without harm to others, by all means, but sometimes it's unavoidable. He talks about this Boy Scout award that was given to 3 terminal Boy Scouts for how they were dealing with their fate. They got an award for bravery and dignity. That has meaning. It's not like a, throw them a bone kind of. I sometimes feel that way. We, oh, how brave. But actually there is strength in that kind of a response of bravery. Sometimes endurance is the greatest achievement. Meaning and achievements can be fulfilled in suffering. You have to work through it, and it's providing you a challenge. He's not glorifying suffering. I want to make that really clear because it's easy to jump to that conclusion. My mother used to always say, you'd say, oh, my leg hurts. And she'd say, offer it up for the souls in purgatory. She'd give anything meaning because there's always the souls in purgatory. So there's no one answer to the question, what's the meaning of life? Because moment by moment, we must respond to the challenges of our unique moment. The meaning may be any of the things that we mentioned, some action, art, creativity, nature, etc., etc. Always there is some opportunity to find meaning. And as long as we're conscious, we must and are responsible for answering life questions. Being human is being conscious and being responsible. We can't renege on that. We can't slouch and not meet that. That's why we're here. The only senseless thing is to throw away opportunity. And therefore, there are certain things that are not truly a solution. And he's very clear as a compassionate psychologist and a doctor to say sometimes people are either medically or in mental health unable to see clearly the way forward and do feel without other choices. But he said doctors are required to help address that, and we are required to not judge individual choice. He said it can be like tossing the board when you're not winning at chess, but sometimes that's an expression of the frustration emotion that you're going through. Does the inevitability of death make life meaningless? And he says, well, here's a question for you. And, a lot of scientists maybe wouldn't ask this question, but he's also a philosopher. He says, does the inevitability of death make life meaningless? He says, well, what if we're immortal? That changes the equation. He argues that if we, our bodies, if they were immortal, we could postpone choices indefinitely all the time in the world, right? Conversely, since we are mortal, and he means, in this life, our bodies are finite, our time and our possibilities are limited. And this makes life meaningful. To exploit a possibility, to make it a reality, to fulfill it, that gives us meaning. Death forms the background that makes living a responsibility. Longevity is not necessarily meaningful. Oh, you're 100. That's so powerful. Not necessarily. A brief life is not meaningless. Judge not by the length, but by the the richness of the history. Is life meaningless if you don't have children? You know, a lot of grandmothers, a lot of yentas out there who kind of feel that way, and I think that's unfortunate because that's not fair. He calls this biological immortalization. He says you don't acquire meaning by giving life to others. It can be very meaningful to you if it's your personal choice. It might not be meaningful to the next person. He said death is a meaningful part of life because each life is unique and significant. So each unique, significant life lost is impactful. And every moment of every life is full of responsibility to life. And any hour whose demands we don't fulfill, we forfeit. Each moment seized becomes permanent in the past. And he says biological life is transitory, but our actions and achievements continue and transcend us and extend beyond us, but not only in the production of biological offspring. The effectiveness of our life is incorporeal. That's why. What we radiate into the world will remain long after bodies are gone. Finite nature of life in the face of death gives life meaning. The finite nature of our relationships makes the lives of each of us meaningful in a unique way. Our imperfections are unique and therefore give us meaning. Should we despair over our imperfections or our inadequacies? I hope not. Should we measure ourselves against what we think ought to be, should be like that person, should have done this accomplishment? No. He says measuring yourself against an ideal can only make you feel less than or worthless. There's pointlessness to that kind of comparison. Each of us is imperfect in a unique, imperfect way. And we are uniquely imperfect and therefore irreplaceable, and this serves a unique role. The uniqueness of our existence and individuality of our essential inner being are meaningful. What matters, what has meaning, is our interaction with each other as unique beings. Our individuality within a community has meaning. And then he says, oh, I already read this quote from another part of the book. He repeats the quote, if I don't do it, who will? If not me, why not? You know, that whole quote. He says, life is not something, it's an opportunity for something. So now we're on the second lecture, part 2, on the meaning and value of life. And this gets far more into suffering. And I think this is really interesting because this is a challenge for us to understand. From part 1, he says, to remind people who weren't at the first lecture, life has meaning. Suffering is an inherent part of life. Therefore, suffering has meaning. And he said, illness is not necessarily suffering. We make that mistake. You can suffer without illness, and you can be ill without suffering. He said mental illness is an illness of the psyche. And he discusses at length illness without suffering. He gives examples of a general paralysis that was caused by a physical illness of syphilis, but a symptom that it causes in the patient, hand in hand with paralysis, the patient experiences an inability to perceive suffering. It changes their mentation, and they'll deny their condition. They don't experience it as a form of suffering or a challenge. He said he's witnessed people with a real illness who don't suffer. They're oblivious to it. Their inability to suffer has been impaired. And this can happen, he said, with some psychiatric illnesses too. He described a case in which a mother and a daughter came to him, and they came for a psychiatric consultation. And the mother, he said, was very agitated, and the daughter was quite calm. And he at first just assumed the mother was the patient, but she wasn't. The daughter was the patient, the one who appeared completely unruffled, was apathetic. The mother was so worried about her daughter that she was in a dither. She had sort of an abnormal level of agitation, but he said, okay, she was abnormally agitated, which is normal as a reaction to an abnormal situation. It was the daughter who was calm, who was not reacting appropriately. And he sees patients who are in a state of depression that causes them the inability to feel anything, including suffering. All they can do is cry, but it's an expression of their despondency. They're not suffering, you know. He said, we would want to eliminate suffering, and if we removed all our past suffering to be rid of the pain, think about this, we would realize that to grow and to mature, we had to go through the joyless periods of existence, the challenges, the things we didn't want to do, the bad things, the hard things. Without them, we would not be who we are today. Without them, any maturity or growth that we would have right now would not be possible. But he admits, maybe ask someone in the middle of suffering. I mean, he admits, you know, you're not going to say, oh yeah, I love my suffering, I'm learning so much. He recalls a work group in the labor camp, and when they weren't being monitored, they would talk together, and they always inevitably talked about food, recipes, menus, favorite foods. And he said they made plans for meals they would have after liberation. But they didn't wish for liberation. They didn't focus on that. They focused on the food, just on the eating part. They longed for the ordinary sufferings of real life outside the camp. They were nostalgic for the tribulations of daily life. Oh, if I could only worry about the light bill again. Only if I could weed the garden again. The kind of things that annoy you, and, you know, petty irritations. And I'd be happy to have a broken leg if I could be out of this hellhole, you know, that kind of conversation. And they didn't worry about the present struggle to survive like an animal. They could not do anything about that. So they distracted themselves thinking about, oh, remember the time that I made this and it didn't work and we were all so upset, you know, that kind of thing. They didn't wish for no suffering. They wished for meaningful suffering. That's a normal part of humanity. What they were experiencing was abnormal. So once again, just to review, the meaning of life is derived from action, creativity, like work, creativity, the experience of love, the experience of the enjoyment of art, by the way we adapt to the unattainable, unalterable, unavoidable limitations of fate, how you accept your fate. In life, he says, we need to learn how to adapt to the challenges of the moment as they change moment by moment. The meaning of life is individual to each different person in any given moment. And he discusses a patient who had a tumor that made him an invalid, and he couldn't do the work that he loved to do. He couldn't be active anymore. So this patient adapted, and he created a reading list and a music list, and he designed a course of learning, and he arranged discussions with people to come and talk with him about it, and give his life a new and different kind of meaning. But eventually he couldn't read and listen and talk, but he was aware and he could communicate somehow. And he asked the doctor to give him the morphine that was provided to ease the terminally ill into death, to avoid pain. So the patient knew that his moment was coming, that it was going to happen that day. And he knew he was going to need it. He didn't need it right that second when he was talking to the doctor, communicating with the doctor. But he knew this was inevitably what was coming in that nighttime. And he knew that he would have to bother the nurses to give him this and upset them and disrupt their overwork. And so he asked the doctor, give it to me early, you know, and then I won't have to bother them later. He said, illness did not provide to this patient a loss of meaning. Said illness gave him the benefit of expanding himself mentally and then his active service to others. He said, an example here, let me find it. Another example. He said he knew a younger woman that he'd known before the war, and he saw her in the camp, and she was in a terrible state, mortally ill. And she knew it. But a few days before she died, she said, I'm grateful to fate for bringing me here. In my earlier bourgeois life, I aspired to be cultured, but somehow I was not very serious about it. Now I'm happy despite everything. Now everything has become serious, and I must prove myself. And as she said this, she was more cheerful than I have ever known her. In this way, she was fortunate. She had succeeded in doing what's demanded of every human being, or wished for every human being, to be able to die his own death. In other words, to meaningfully incorporate even death into the whole of life. Yes, even to fulfill the meaning of life in death. He recalls a patient facing death with the attitude, I can put to the test my fighting spirit, gathering my strength to endure what comes. So this meaning derived from illness and dying is an internal success. It, on the outside may not look like that. The attitude can be applied to all of life. All of life dies and therefore could be called unsuccessful because it inevitably dies, but it's made successful in the process of facing each challenge that's provided along the way and using that opportunity as it presents itself to choose meaning. He points to Tolstoy's kind of short novel, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. And if you have not read that book, it's short. I highly recommend it. Tolstoy can be kind of tough going, the Russians, you know, but it's a really good book. A dying man finding meaning in his life that he once thought futile. And it's about more than that, though. It's a very interesting book. How can anyone say an ill person is worthless or that someone is unworthy of life? Anyone can contribute to the research of his illness, to the opportunity for someone else to be of service, to be a model of acceptance and patience. He said only the sick person gets to decide and should not be written off by anybody else. We just, each of us decide what our value is in the situation we're in. Doctors tend to be objective and they dissociate from the humanity of patients. This was much truer before, I don't know. Never mind. He said they do it in order to be able to make hard decisions, and there is some truth to that. But they shouldn't let that make it easy to write people off. I don't think most of them do. I really don't believe that. It's the system is the real toxic situation. We always need to call ourselves back from objectivity to humanity. You can't do that. You can't be impartial. We must remember the human is the patient. I think he was talking to a group of doctors. The patient is never just his disease, but a human. The Nazis denied the humanity of the sick, the disabled, the mentally ill, and today, our time, the government denies the need to fund or consider care for the sick, for the aged, for veterans, for the mentally ill. To even raise the question of the worth of the sick is a degradation and an objectification that we must reject. For example, House members who say that older people, there was a House member during the last administration, Trump administration, during the unfortunate medical event of that time period in 2020, who said, older people, let's open up the country again for the economy's sake. Older people will be glad to accept the risk, the higher risk to them. they might die, but if they're doing it in the interests of the economy, I'm sure they'll be glad to do that. But he points out how the incurable during the war were declared unworthy of life because of their illnesses. And this is an unacceptable political ideology, and was used by the Nazis. And to analyze this, first ask yourself, what is meant by incurable? He points out a patient who had a mental state that stayed in bed and wouldn't respond, wouldn't eat, had to be tube fed to avoid dying for 5 years, until one day, just one ordinary day, asked for food, started exercising, and eventually went home cured, and then returned to give a lecture about what was going on inside of him during those 5 years. And it was a remarkable inner life, and he was aware of all that was said and done around him. The point is, how do we know that somebody is really incurable? Every year, conditions thought hopeless can now be helped with new treatments. I don't know. I find this a real dilemma. Doctors never have the right to make a judgment about the value or worthlessness of a life. Imagine if that right were to become a law. Does the state have the right to eliminate the unproductive? This is the question that he's asking. If this is an effort to help the economy, then it's already a doomed assumption. Usefulness to society must never be our sole or most important criterion. And I think you need to keep it in the context of the individual life. An elderly loved one who only sits and dozes, now, how useful is that? Should that old person be eliminated? But such a person may have a wide circle of people who love him, who dote on him, who care for him. And even if it's an unrelated caretaker who punches a time clock, there are opportunities to test patience and compassion and acts of service offered to this caretaker. It's a complex situation. It's not superficial and easy to figure out. Love gives this person meaning. Love is not earned, it's given. It's a blessing, and often the result of our uniqueness and our individuality. So Frankl describes a patient who was severely disabled from birth, whose mother loved this person and cherished the person. And absolutely, the mother's life was destroyed when the Nazis took her child into their euthanasia program. The loss to her was immeasurable. Can we decide someone in that condition is unable to make such a decision for himself? Some may say we are obliged to do those sorts of actions. We're obliged to do the kind of things we assume the patient would do if they were capable of making the decision. And these are his words, not mine. And I don't really want to get into that debate. It's convoluted, but he's exploring these different ethical dilemmas. He ascribes a colleague with terminal cancer who knew he was dying. Well, he describes a colleague with terminal cancer who knew that he was dying, but whose will to live grew as he neared the end. And he believes no one has the right to deny the right for a patient to decide. Even in cases of failed attempts, he says doctors have the duty to try to help. That may have been the patient's decision and it didn't work, but the doctor has a duty to try to help the person. Some argue that doctors shouldn't intervene in those sorts of cases. Obviously, the patient's made his choice, but he says that no, that they've taken an oath. So he says the meaningfulness of existence is unconditional, that even suffering can lead and can lend meaning. to death and to illness. I'm trying to sneeze here, sorry. No one has the right to judge another person unworthy. Answers to the meaning of life only exist in our response to each unique moment. We can't direct fate. How we relate to it ascribes meaning. Does fate, the universe, have meaning? Now we're really getting out there. It goes beyond logic. He says we're at the horizon of ultimate meaning with this question, and you can only find these answers within. Can't be asking other people. He says if we decide to believe, then it's ultimate meaning, and it will have a creative effect. Belief brings into being that which is believed. This is final sentence in this lecture. And now we're on the final part of the book, the experimentum crucis, which is critical experiment, the crucial experiment done to proving or disproving an hypothesis. He describes the march of 280 men led by the SS south of Munich in 1945 from the Kaufering camp, a labor camp. They were being marched as slave labor to build munitions factory in the forest. And they were in terrible shape. And he describes one man who thought about the future lecture that he would give, the psychoanalysis of concentration camp. The psychology of the concentration camp. Who is this man? It was Frankl. And he said now he was free to give the lecture. And so this is the lecture that he created on that death march. That's how he got through camp. So he said, when you come into a camp like this, you're arrested and you end up in this camp, your first reaction upon admission is shock. You're shocked that you survived the initial extermination. Only 5% did. Then you're taken to disinfection, and you're not sure until it happens if that's really what you're up against. All your personal belongings are removed. All your hair is removed. He says this is a true definition of naked existence. He said there's a complete elimination of your entire former existence. And then the natural progress of this shock is thoughts of ending it all. He said everyone does in this situation entertain that notion. There was an electric wire around the camp and people would run into it purposefully. And eventually, though, if they didn't do it at the beginning, most of them were resigned to the situation and they thought, well, it's either the wire or the gas. It's inevitable, one or the other. He said, with no longer needing to wish for the wire, because you knew that the gas would provide the same thing. You didn't have to wish for the wire because now you had the gas to be afraid of. He said there was no need to fear gas once you've wished for the wire. So they were kind of a mutually exclusive situation. He said an old colleague sought him out in Auschwitz and always gave the impression of being fit to work. And he told him at the beginning, do that, no matter how you feel. Look like you could get up and work at any moment. He said, if your shoes are tight and your foot hurts because your shoes don't fit, don't limp. Do not give any sign of weakness. Only those capable of work are considered fit to live. If you don't work, you're unworthy of life. And he recommended to the slaves, this older camper guy, every day try to look clean and try to look healthy. And the best thing to do is find a broken piece of glass or something and shave yourself, because it'll make you look more flushed, rosier, healthier, and cleaner. His friend so his friend gave them the advice. They all took it, and then he told them, yeah, you did a good job. You did a good job. He didn't pass Frankl. But Frankl, he kind of felt like, okay, well, I'm going to die anyway. So I don't need to worry about what direction it comes from. he said that's a normal progression of admission to the camp, the the initial shock and everything and loss of identity, and then an indifference to one's own fate. You become emotionally numb. You're less affected by the activity around you. Your inner life is reduced to a minimum. You become less terrorized, less outraged, less disgusted. You become desensitized. Um, all thoughts, all efforts are geared towards survival. All of your spiritual life is geared towards survival. Your soul develops a protective shell around it. It tries to protect the self from the power of the swamp. It tries to preserve your equilibrium, and you aim for a self-protective indifference. So after that shock, and after you've become desensitized and you've become self-protected and in the survival mode, he said the next place that you achieve is apathy. You become like an animal with one thought, survival, a herd animal. He said you could see this when they were called out for roll call every day, or they were called to march someplace. There was always a scuffle to get in the center of the crowd where you were more protected from notice. Everyone wanted to be out of reach and out of notice. Each one hopes not to draw attention, and each is trying to disappear into the mass. There's a decline of the personal sphere. You become a creature of the masses and a primitive. And he said, psychoanalysts, this is their opinion, and this is how they analyzed it, that what happens is a regression, a retreat to a primitive state, a retreat to the animal impulse. And he said, what are primitive wishes? Food. He says his was a particular gâteau. Cigarettes, coffee, and a warm bath. Those were ultimately the things the people thought about. But this was only one result. There are other forms of regression. Some people did not really regress. They made inner progress. They grew beyond themselves and achieved true human greatness because of their experiences in the camp. So he talks about a characterologist, Emil Utitz, who was not a psychoanalytic person. He was a characterologist. He believed that camp inmates developed according to a schizoid type. So now keep in mind, this was a while ago. Terminology and understanding has changed. But in this guy's experience, he said that people were swinging between apathy and irritability, sort of a cyclical temperament, rejoicing to high heaven or having terrible depths of despair. They were in a permanent cycle of joyful excitation and depressive sadness. Frankl made this observation: the inmate who is not under any compunction to get involved in his inner development towards becoming, so the inmate who doesn't make the effort to get involved in his own inner development then moves towards developing the typical prisoner cycle of those two schizoid opposite reactions. He doesn't have to be like that, depths of despair, the heights of sort of a manic thing. You can retain the freedom to adapt to your fate and your environment in one way or the other. You don't have to be in a constant state. He said some manage to overcome apathy and purposelessness and to suppress irritability and do things differently. Inner freedom cannot be taken away from you, even when everything else is. He said they could escape the power and influence of the environment and not be governed by its rules. They could resist them and could withdraw from them and not obey blindly. And he says to give up that freedom is to let the self fall spiritually. And they had to fight against that tendency to fall. And when does the fall begin? He said it begins as soon as you lose that inner hold, as soon as you stop worrying about your evolution spiritually. He said you could choose to hold on to two things, either one or the other, either the future or eternity. He said if you held on to the future, you were constantly thinking about what was coming in the future. You couldn't foresee the future, and you began to envy criminals who had a release date because at least they had an end to their sentence. He said the really religious people tended to be the ones holding on to eternity. These people didn't think about liberation or a future life outside. They focused on how they were reacting on a moment by moment basis. The others were always telling themselves the war will be over in 6 weeks. The war will be over in 2 months, 4 months, whatever. And they found themselves disappointed and bitter. And then this is a great quote that he said. Hope deferred makes the heart sick. He tells of prisoners who dreamed, a prisoner who dreamed that he'd be freed on March 31st. And so he woke up and he told everybody, oh, we're going to be freed by March 31st. And, March 30th rolled along and nothing happened. And within 24 hours, he caught typhus and died. So the loss of spiritual mental hold, his sense of disappointment that no liberation was in sight, actually led to a physical decline. The only therapy for this is psychotherapy. It provides a spiritual hold and can give life meaning. Because that's the question it tries to help people figure out. Thinking of the words of Nietzsche, who once said, whoever has a why to live can almost always bear any how. A why that is a part of the content of life, and the how, those were the conditions of life that made camp life so difficult that it only became bearable with regard to a why. So if there was basically nothing other than psychotherapy to enable people to endure the camp, then this psychotherapy was already defined in a particular sense, since it needed to endeavor to convince the person who was being asked to muster the will to survive that this survival had meaning. Where did I go? Where am I? The only care that they could give was the care of inmates' souls, but it was very hard because they couldn't count on surviving all the way through. So these psychologists and therapists who were in this camp with people who were trying to help people, they couldn't guarantee anything. And the situation became the experimentum crucis, which was the definitive experiment that proved the hypotheses. Even suffering that seems to be in vain outside can be fulfilled within. So the situation in the camps, they needed to see the meaning in suffering and death. That was the goal. And suffering and death in the camps was given meaning on an individual basis, how that individual chose to face what they were facing. It had nothing to do with the death that the SS were forcing on them. The meaning had everything to do with how they responded to their situation moment by moment. And he said, you have to decide for yourself. They each had to decide for themselves. Each one knew somewhere, somehow, someone was there unseen watching over, who demanded of him that he would be worthy of his sufferings, as Dostoevsky once said, and expected of him that he should die his own death. Each of us felt this expectation at that time when death was near, and we felt it all the more the less we felt that we ourselves could still expect anything from life, that someone or something was still waiting for us at all, and that we might expect to survive at all. The pain the inmates experienced and survived was as surprising to him as it was to the world. The fact that they went through that pain, looking at how awful that was, the fact that they survived it surprised them too. And human psyche is even, he says, it's like a vaulted arch. It can support the heavy load that's put on it. The soul is strengthened by experiencing a burden. It's why seemingly weak people were able to survive, physically falling apart people. They could survive and emerge stronger of mind. And he said that then you get liberated, and the sudden liberation, the release, can be a shock and do damage. It's like decompression sickness, the bends. You go too high up and the air pressure is lower, and the carbon dioxide goes into the blood, and it can form clots and can form blocks and kill you. It's called the bends that divers get. That's why divers go up out of the pressurized deep water. They go up much more slowly. So this decompression sickness, which requires emerging slowly, is required emerging from the kind of traumatic situation that they were in. And, people got no help. It was terrible. It was really bad. And he says it takes many days for a freed inmate to even come to the realization that they're liberated. And this is the third part of what psychotherapy has to face as far as concentration camps go. How to learn, how to relearn, how to be happy and avoid that decompression sickness. And, the survivor, he says, they hear, we knew nothing about it, or worse, we suffered too, and can suffering be measured or assessed or compared to each other? And he says, no. Real suffering is individual. It fills a person's whole being. It doesn't matter what it is to other people. It's the experiencer for whom it's meaningful. He talked about how his time in the camp with friends, he talked about it with a friend who had survived Stalingrad, and his friend compared himself to what Frankl went through and told Frankl he was embarrassed that he'd only gone through Stalingrad. And he said, but, you can't compare that. There are differences. He goes, in battle, one faces nothingness and stares death in the face. In the camps, the inmates were nothing, and they were already dead. They were dead in life. They were worth nothing. They were nothingness. They saw nothingness. They counted for nothing. Death counted for nothing. And they had lived a living death. And each suffering is unique to the individual. It cannot be compared. The magnitude of it is dependent solely on the sufferer. Let's see here. What have I got? A person's solitary suffering is just as unique and individual as every person. The only real difference is between the meaningful and the meaningless. And it depends on the individual. Only he can decide. Meaningful, not meaningful. Ethics and metaphysics of everyday life come into play. Not knowing, he said, and he talked about this before, is really not wanting to know. And it's wanting to escape responsibility. And it's a fear of having to accept collective guilt. He talks quite a bit about collective guilt, which is pretty interesting. It's hard to synopsize. He said, you could be considered guilty and complicit, even if you are not guilty of doing anything yourself. Should the decent person really be held accountable for the offenses of others, even if the offenders belong to the same nation? This question comes up on the topic of reparations. We should think about this. Was the decent man not himself the victim of an offense, the object of a terror that was carried out by somebody else, a ruling leading class, without him able to stand up against the terror? Did he not suffer under it himself? Would not the establishment of a collective guilt be a relapse into exactly the worldview that we want to combat? That worldview that declares an individual guilty because others from the same group to which he happens to belong have actual or allegedly committed some kind of offense. And how ridiculous this outlook seems to us today, finally, holding someone to account because of their nationality, native language, place of birth, must seem as ridiculous to us today as making them responsible for their own height. If a criminal who is 1.64 meters tall is arrested, should I also be hanged because I happen to be the same height? These are interesting concepts to contemplate. They make my head hurt. So collective guilt, and then there's liability without guilt. In other words, you may have done nothing wrong, but you still have responsibility. A nation that could not liberate itself was powerless to liberate itself and had nothing to do with active guilt. Their powerlessness, it would be unfair of them to have to pay for their liberation with sacrifice and to feel guilt. But they are jointly liable, even if not complicit, and knowing that there's no guilt. That's a Gordian knot of thinking. The survivors knew that they carried some guilt because the best of them did not survive. We've talked about that. They saw their survival as an undeserved mercy. They felt they owed their dead comrades, and they felt that guilt, and they tried to settle it by shaking up and keeping alert the conscience of others. They often returned home and forgot about that oath they made to their dead comrades. Small moments, though, let them fulfill their oath when they could appreciate things like good bread, clean bed, no roll call in the morning, not having to live in constant danger of death, and feeling born again in your true essence. But a lot of them had very little ambition left. They felt so depleted. But they did yearn for self-realization. He said, we must act all of this in our everyday lives, the metaphysics of everyday lives. Everyday life is transparent, so we can look through it into the eternal. I thought that was an interesting sentence. We're responsible for the events, and history is our responsibility. So is our future. We bring what has not yet happened into the world. Every day, life is reality and the potential for action, and we must feel joy in taking responsibility. It leads us forward and it guides us. Does the average person feel happy to take on responsibility? I would say no. But he says we're drawn to responsibility. We withdraw from it, and those two opposing forces prevent us from embracing it and embracing responsibility. We often recoil from it. There's something terrible and glorious about the responsibility of being a human being. It's difficult to know in every moment I bear responsibility for the next moment by the decision I make right now. Each decision is for all eternity. And in each moment, I can actualize the moment or I can forfeit it. Every moment has thousands of possibilities. Each choice condemns all the other unmade choices to never being. The future is dependent on each small individual decision. Everything we do saves itself into reality. It becomes history. We need to be educated about our responsibilities, and I don't believe we do that for our children. It's a burden to recognize and commit to our responsibilities and to say yes to life. But we see that some people say yes despite the difficulties. The camp inmates said yes to life many times under unspeakable conditions. So today, in much milder conditions, we should be able to do that too. To say yes always is meaningful and possible. And then final little tidbit here. Ultimately, that was the entire purpose of these parts, to show you that people can still, despite hardship and death, despite suffering from the physical or mental illnesses, or under the fate of something they can't change, like a concentration camp, people can still say yes to life in spite of everything. So his other book, Man's Search for Meaning, was voted one of the 10 most influential books in America. So thank you for listening. I hope this book was as meaningful for you as it has been for me. I find such value in Viktor Frankl's experience and his sharing of what he learned. And that's how the suffering of the concentration camp gave his life meaning. We benefit. Tell me what you think. I'm curious to see what people think. Now, that was the book for this week. Heavy duty, lots of thinking, don't hurt your brain. Next week, I have an equally important book, but there's some moments of just absurdity in it that I know you're going to enjoy. So thank you very much for watching. You guys have a good weekend, and I'll be back. Slán go fóill. It's lunch.